We've got Joshua Becker on the podcast. Joshua is a postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern, and he's studying collective intelligence, which is kind of an abstract term, but he has recently published a lot of research on social learning and polarization, and has previously done some stuff on tipping points and how information spreads throughout social networks. So he's a computational social scientist with a specific interest in networks and information spreading and tipping points and all those kinds of fun emergent phenomena. So in this episode, we start by talking about polarization and some of the research that Joshua has done on social learning occurring even in highly polarized situations, which actually goes against a lot of people's intuition that no one can agree on anything and that polarization completely ruins the ability of people to agree on facts. And then we sort of transition to some bigger picture ideas about actually creating change and when tipping points happen and the way that social networks impact the broader structure of society as a whole. So this is a pretty great episode, gets pretty deep at some points. So check this one out and enjoy. So, echo chambers, are they real? Go.
So, the thing about echo chambers, from my perspective, is that they're not really a scientific concept. If you ever see me refer to echo chambers in my research, or more likely my casual writing or conversation, it's just to orient you to a particular, problem or way of thinking about things, or broad set of phenomena, which is to say politics today. There are some characteristics often associated with echo chambers that we can study scientifically, but it's not necessarily clear whether everybody who studies echo chambers or talks about them in any capacity is always referring to, any one of these phenomena in particular. So, for example, one oft-cited characteristic of human social networks is homophily, which is like finds like, or birds of a feather flock together. So in politics, that's the fact that most people who are Republicans are friends and family with Republicans, and most people who are Democrats are friends and family with Democrats, and that extends oftentimes to the workplace, partially because there's geographical patterns. So in that sense, echo chambers emerge because people are exposed to social and public opinion that already agrees with them, but then they get this perception that, the majority tends to agree with me. My way of thinking is just the normal way of thinking, and anybody who disagrees is, kind of wacko or from the outside or not the mainstream, as it were. So that's one aspect of echo chambers. Another, I suppose, is a similar type of phenomena, but it's more a factor of contemporary media consumption, which is to say selective exposure, I think is what a lot of people call it. I read the news that I want to read, which more often than not is something that already agrees with me. So these are a couple different related but very distinct things. One's a feature of social networks, and one is a feature of media consumption. And so you can study those factors and ask questions about how they shape belief accuracy or attitudes on either other people or other political parties or, particular policies. But whether or not echo chambers are real is, I think, a bit of a red herring in terms of a question.
Sure. So you can see these clusterings of people who have similar beliefs, but that may just be a different social dynamic of them wanting to cluster together because they have similar beliefs. And it's not necessarily the fact that they're being radicalized by a YouTube algorithm or a Facebook group or something like that.
Sure, that's true. And a lot of people do spend effort and resources and time trying to figure out just to what extent is this true? So, people try to get their hands on data about media consumption to see how much selective exposure happens, or try to measure Twitter follower networks to see if people are in fact becoming more or less clustered in their social networks, or at least their media networks. Or, I guess Twitter is a place where media and social gets kind of ambiguous, right? So I suppose there's really two questions to ask. One is, are they real in the sense that empirically, to what extent do we see these characteristics? We might think about when we think about echo chambers. But then there's a whole other set of questions, not about what is real, but about what the effect is. I think for me, that's where I spend most of my time thinking, asking questions like, okay, so what if we are in fact all talking to people who already agree with us? Does that mean it's not possible for, something like collective intelligence to emerge, right?
Yeah. And so, based upon that then, you have some research about people attempting to, make estimations about certain facts, and you expose them to a variety of different conditions related to partisan politics or trying to sort of control out any of that kind of like political identification, and you see some interesting results then in terms of how accurate people are and how they actually update their beliefs. So what did you actually find in looking at that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So for me, I'm starting from this perspective of studying collective intelligence more broadly. And the research there is focused on first asking the basic question of, is there collective intelligence, right? So are people smarter when they're talking and working together than when they're working independently? And one of our very consistent findings on belief accuracy, which is to say, in the simplest case, we show you a jar of jelly beans and ask how many jelly beans are there in the jar, right? That's a type of belief, something we can definitely measure accuracy on. So one of our basic questions is that question of, do people become more accurate after they learn what other people think, or maybe just chat with them a little bit? And our very consistent finding is that yes, they do, which to the collective intelligence community was a big finding for a lot of reasons. But then immediately comes up the question like, okay, that's all well and good when you're counting jelly beans in a jar, but we really care about things where our beliefs are shaped by all kinds of cognitive biases. And maybe the way we respond to social information is going to be shaped by all kinds of cognitive biases. And inevitably someone would say, so yeah, Joshua, but what about politics, right? That's a place where cognitive biases play a very big role in both our beliefs and our social interactions. So for us, it was a question of, is collective intelligence robust to partisan political bias? So we did 2 studies there that looked at this question of homophily, which is to say, again, people in social networks hanging out with other people who already agree with them. So we did one study where we looked at Democrats and Republicans interacting with each other in a social network, because there's a lot of concerns even about the opposite of echo chambers. So there's a lot of people who are actually concerned that when you're interacting with people from the other political party, there's actually backfire effects. Instead of, thinking about what's true or false, you just try to become as different as you can from the other side. Like, oh, I heard Democrats think, there's 100 jelly beans in the jar. That seems low to me. So, I'm going to raise my estimate from 500 to 1,000 just so I can disagree with them, right? And then we did another study where we put Democrats in networks with other Democrats and Republicans in networks with other Republicans, because in that case, we wanted to study echo chambers, of course. So it was an interesting kind of space going into it, because it's like, no matter what type of networks you have, somebody's got a theory that says collective intelligence is going to fail as a result of this, that, or the other, cognitive bias related to how we perceive political parties or people from political parties, or even just how we consume information and make decisions. So to make, several years of research brief, what we found simply was that yes, collective intelligence is robust to partisan political bias. Now, to unpack again some of the details from what made this, a difficult study to run, we realized that there's a lot going on in politics, a lot going on in social networks, a lot going on in partisan bias and those kind of those issues. We're not saying that polarization doesn't exist, for example. We're just looking at a very, very specific corner of this question about the intersection of politics, social networks, and belief accuracy. So our research is, in a way, I think, a ray of light in a dark world. It shows, one, fairly optimistic finding about collective intelligence being robust to partisan bias, but it's also at the same time very possible to come up with many plausible scenarios in which our results might break down, right? So we know that the world doesn't always work exactly as it does in a specific laboratory experiment. I just feel it's always important to add that very big caveat whenever talking about this research, because it's a nice finding, and to some extent it gets people off my back when I'm trying to talk about the generalizability of collective intelligence research in terms of showing that it applies in some pretty important circumstances, but in terms of when we're moving from collective intelligence research to political theory more broadly, that's where we really have to acknowledge that, like, yes, and there's a lot of other things going on.
Sure. So the our argument might be something like, okay, Joshua, you're talking about collective intelligence, and people are really good as a group at estimating how many jelly beans are in a jar, because some people guess way too high and some people guess way too low, and then everyone kind of updates their estimation based upon what they see, and people actually get pretty good at that. But here's the thing, everyone is in these isolated Facebook groups, they're incentivized to post inflammatory content. I've seen this thing saying that if I, as a Republican, read a Democrat's post, or if I, as a Democrat, read a Republican's post, I just get mad and think that they're stupid, and that people who are more intelligent seemingly are better at coming up with explanations for why data isn't correct. So all this, kumbaya stuff about the group being good at estimating jelly beans has nothing to do with real life, because Twitter is a hellscape and we're all gonna fall apart in a civil war. And you are like, well, actually, we looked at it and that's not exactly what we found. And I think I guess something that might be good to dig into is what you actually looked at, which is estimations of like specific facts and what that process looked like in terms of people making estimations and then how they learn from each other.
Yeah. So first, I want to backtrack. I just want to backtrack a second, because I want to address something you said about, whether does it work in politics or is it at all useful in the real world? And they're not quite in opposition to each other. So, primarily, I work in a management department, and a lot of my research is motivated by understanding how organizations do or can work. And I love organizations as a scientist in part because they are kind of like little laboratories. So it's sort of like, if we can do something in a lab and I'm a manager in your department or division, then I can do it in my department or division to some extent, right? So organizations have a lot more control over the structure of their little mini societies than we might have over something like politics. So they're pretty different types of questions. Is it useful in the real world versus is it useful in politics? But then, yes. So remind me, what was the question you tacked on at the end of that?
Yeah, totally. So you kind of gave a layout that, even in this political minefield that people seem to think breaks all the rules of social intelligence and people actually learning from each other, that you did in fact see people learning from each other. Right. And I think it might be worthwhile to dig into some of the actual questions you were asking and how people updated their beliefs.
Okay, great. Yeah, and you're going to test me now on the details of the appendix of our paper. So this was a little while ago, but I'll see how many I can remember. So it is, it's an important feature of this study was that we didn't just ask about things like jelly beans or visual estimation tasks. We're asking about stuff that's relevant and somewhat controversial. In fact, we even pre-tested questions to identify what were the most controversial ones, which we measured by saying how far apart were Democrats and Republicans in their answers. So the way the framework within which we're working goes is that you have to ask something with a number, because then we can measure how accurate are you. So we ask questions like, how much has the number of illegal immigrants in the United States, I forget the exact phrasing, changed in the last 10 years? So we're looking for a number. And we would give in parentheses, I forget if that one was in millions or in percentage or something like that. But, we try to make it as clear as possible so that variation is due to, false information and not misunderstanding the question. And we asked questions like, George W. Bush had X number of dollars raised for his campaign in, I don't remember now, 2004 election? Is that when he ran? 2000? Whenever he ran against Kerry, right? And how much did the other guy have in his campaign? Or things like how many people died in the Iraq War? So questions we're using a mix of things where in the pre-tests they show numerically large differences, as well as questions that just from prior literature for various theoretical or empirical reasons were identified as particularly shaped by partisan bias. So we're trying to hit all the bases with the types of questions and the types of ways they might be related to partisan bias.
Sure. And so what you saw then is that there were, in fact, differences between how Republicans and Democrats estimate these numbers, right? Sort of what you would expect along partisan lines, where people estimate the numbers incorrectly in the direction that sort of supports their ideology. But that kind of no matter how you framed the iterated rounds where they were communicating with other people, that everyone did in fact get better, even when exposed to significant partisan cues. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. So we also tested a condition where they were just answering questions in a very neutral kind of web interface. You know, it's all happening simultaneous with other people. We get hundreds of people come in at the same time so that we can show them information in real time and let them, you know, revise or react. But there's one version was just very neutral. I forget exactly what we called it. This kind of estimation challenge or something like that. And then there was one where we really just threw in the kitchen sink in terms of features that are known to prime people to partisan bias. So we'd found in previous research that, like, whether or not there's a picture of an elephant and a donkey, the logos for the political parties is on the page, whether or not these party logos is on the page shapes how strongly your belief as well as your reaction to other people's beliefs is shaped by partisan bias. So we just threw in the kitchen sink. We put the elephant and the donkey there. We called the website the Politics Challenge. We made people affirm their party membership just before the start of the experiment, even though we already kind of had pre-screened people so we knew what parties they were. Other details like that. We told them, like, we didn't just say, here's the average answer of other people. We're like, other Republicans like you or other Democrats like you. So we kind of put it all in terms of trying to get that partisan bias. And the reason, so that was actually a second set of trials. And the reason we did that was because we had started with this first set of trials, which was a little more neutral. We had we had chosen questions based strictly on the numeric size of the bias or difference between Republicans and Democrats, and not so much on the intuitive or theoretical expectation for bias. And then the reviewers came back and said, like, this is a really interesting question. Your results are promising, but we don't think you're really capturing bias. So we went and did this whole second version to try to, you know, basically push people's buttons as much as possible. Now, one, to me, really interesting finding from this second round is that even then, in a numeric sense, there wasn't that big of a difference between Republicans and Democrats. And we wanted that difference. That was the whole point of the study. So we really did everything we could to drum up that numeric difference. We just didn't find a huge difference. So that, to me, was sort of as a secondary lesson of running this research. That was a huge piece of it. So when people talk about partisan bias, they tell this narrative that makes you think of what we call statistically multimodal distributions. So when you look at a distribution of anything, you know, beliefs or number of cars produced in a year, whatever, it looks like that kind of normal curve or just like sort of an up-down curve. And the point of it is the mode that's the most popular belief. So we have this image of partisan divide as two distinct modes, two distinct lumps in the belief or opinion distribution. And we simply didn't find that. And one of the things I was doing as I was designing the second round was I was looking everywhere I could for this multimodal distribution. So this paper was about factual belief accuracy and not opinions, but I started looking at opinions too. I downloaded the ANES data. I forget what that acronym stands for. I think Annual National Election Survey. It's one of those big official ones run by Pew or something like that. So I download their data, and they're asking opinion questions like, how do you feel about this policy or this person? So I start looking everywhere for that multimodal distribution, thinking, oh, maybe I can find something factual related to that issue. And even in that type of data, it's almost exclusively unimodal, which is to say, yeah, there's measurable statistical differences between Democrats and Republicans, but it doesn't look nearly like what you'd expect it to look like with all this basically fear-mongering around how divided we are as a population. Then now it does appear for some questions, for sure. Things like what you'd expect to be the really, really hot button politicized things, climate change, the wall with Mexico. Those are the two topics that really stick out in my mind. And even that was the opinion stuff, not so much the factual stuff.
Sure. So I think that something I found really interesting about the results that you found is that, people have an intuition that there's this extreme polarization. They have an intuition that people are, unable to agree on facts and all these things. And it seems like people are reacting to something that's at least partially real, right? You did see differences between, using partisan cues or not in terms of how people estimated, that they were worse at estimating when you expose them to a bunch of partisan cues, but that they were still better at estimating after iterating and talking to each other, even under like the worst conditions for that to happen. Is that correct?
Right. So to try to summarize that a little bit, we pretty much always observe social learning or collective intelligence, but the extreme partisan cues kind of dampen that. So you're still learning, maybe you're just not learning quite as much. And to be honest, I think it's still a little unclear exactly why that's going on and how generalizable that is, which is to say we may or may not see it in different cases. But this is where all those, I want to talk about some of those caveats, if that's all right. So, and this is why I love science, by the way. So that the paper with the mixed networks, Republicans and Democrats, and remember that's motivated by, on the one hand, some people are saying like, you have to have cross-cutting social ties because you got to break out of the echo chambers. And other people are saying, cross-cutting social ties just produce backfire effects. So we had the mixed networks, Republicans and Democrats together. That was I want to say that came out the summer of 2018. And that same summer, there's another paper that comes out by a colleague of mine, sociologist Chris Bale at Duke University. I mean, I said colleague of mine, but he's like, a real kind of big banana, as some people say. He runs I forget what it's called, but the Polarization Lab. They're getting really serious about deeply diving into this stuff. But he had a paper that comes out that same summer. So our paper briefly says, hey, look, Democrats and Republicans talking to each other, collective intelligence still works. Like, yeah, some things can dampen the effects, but it still works. And then Chris's paper comes out and says, look, we had Democrats and Republicans interact with each other. They're doing a field experiment. So they actually had people observing out-group Twitter accounts. So if you're a Republican, you're gonna be exposed to a Democratic Twitter account. If you're a Democrat, you're gonna be exposed to a Republican Twitter account. And what they found was that polarization increased. So we found that Democrats and Republicans became more similar. They're just being drawn towards the true answer. But they found that polarization increased, and the difference lies very much in how you define polarization. So we're looking at polarization on these factual beliefs, right? Asking people numbers and then looking and seeing how different are the numbers for Democrats and the numbers for Republicans. But what Chris was asking was basically like, how do you feel about Republicans and how do you feel about Democrats? So that's what people call affective polarization. Affect is just a broad, I guess, psychological concept of how you feel about something versus, what you think in a factual sense. And so what they're doing is they're exposing people to Twitter content, which isn't going to be just what other people's factual beliefs are. That's going to be memes and mudslinging and, really vitriolic stuff. So you look at that stuff and that's shaping how you feel about, the other side. So on what I really like about science and the fact that these two papers came out is that there's this very kind of broad dialogue through these different studies that helps to sketch out essentially these two poles. So on the one pole, the one extreme end of things, this factual, very kind of objective interactions, you get collective intelligence. On the other, you get increased polarization, and it starts to lay out the boundaries, and then you can fill in the points in between and ask just what are the conditions under which we get one or the other, and how can we define things in different ways, and how do those definitions shape our perspective on things. So I just love this pair of papers because I think it really nicely frames the possibility space in the sense that they come to completely opposite conclusions, but then you can problematize that and ask what's the differences. So that's the caveat. But the real world or the broad picture of things, I suppose, is somewhere between those two, the most optimistic and most pessimistic findings.
Yeah, and that there, like you said, there's an element of like, okay, if we're doing something that is focused on an actual fact, that polarization and partisanship can potentially dampen social learning, but it's still always going to occur. But if it's something that's much more opinion-based, that it's much more possible for people to potentially go into that sort of like bimodal distribution that you're talking about.
Right, exactly. Or, maybe. So whenever you get to the end of any of these papers, we start further research, we speculate maybe this, that, or the other thing. And then a lot of that sort of behind the scenes. So you saw this at the end of our paper on echo chambers, was things like, so yeah, we're measuring factual accuracy where we pay people to be accurate, but maybe on Twitter, people aren't incentivized to be accurate. They're incentivized to be, ostentatious or whatever gets me, provocative, where they're incentivized to be provocative and because they just want to get retweeted, right? And part of that, the behind the scenes that during the review process, all the reviewers are saying, hey, maybe it's this, that, or the other thing, you have to address that. So it gives us a license to speculate a little bit on how some of those conditions, which we then take and I do earnestly follow through. So I just wrote a grant, knock on wood that we get some funding. I just wrote a grant that took basically the end of that paper and said, hey, here's all this open stuff and all these possibilities. Give us more money and we'll run some more experiments and try to figure it out.
We'll solve it for you. So my own speculation, or a question that I would have would be related to how the language is coded in like different tweets or articles or whatever, right? That I would be curious to see, you potentially get this more, like bimodal effect if you're dealing with, people on Twitter posting vitriolic, inflammatory stuff that's actually upsetting people. But I wonder if you get a similar effect if you expose people to like, say people on the left, you expose them to a Ross Douthat column in the New York Times, right? And you expose people on the right to like an Ezra Klein article on Vox, two people who I'd consider to be, relatively intellectually honest and non-inflammatory, and they don't write in as much like coded language. Right? So if someone on the left sees someone talking about like free markets and pull yourself up by the bootstraps and make America great again, that sort of like triggers something in them where that's coded language for something they're against. And someone on the right is potentially going to have a similar reaction to diversity, equity, and inclusion and speaking truth to power, where they see that as coded language as something that they're against. And I'd be curious to see, how the coding of the language as potentially being a partisan signal in and of itself would impact how much that effect occurs.
So that's certainly all absolutely possible. And I want to go back, though, to your sort of assumption that there is this bimodal distribution. So it's certainly possible that like the reason there, and probable, in fact, I think that's a good theory, that the reason we're finding polarization in one study and not the other is because of these different ways of communicating. And one of the broad takeaways for me from our research is that if you want to try to decrease polarization or, promote a more effective public dialogue, try to focus things on the facts instead of on the opinions. As you say, you get these more reasoned columnists. They're probably less likely to produce a backfire effect. But even with Chris Bale's findings, you have to remember that in most of that ANES data, I'm not seeing these bimodal distributions. I'm not seeing this sign that, oh, we're so far apart. And those, of course, are still opinions. So it's still just, there's facts and opinions, but then the question of how do I feel about other people is yet a third thing. So it's clear, I think, that we hate each other, or, at least can't get along very well in a lot of public spheres. But most of the data still suggests that we're not actually that different in our beliefs about the world or even our opinions on many things. And so the question, I think, is, part of it's going to be, why is there then all this, affective polarization? Why do we hate each other so much? But it's also to some extent a question of, do we really? Are we as polarized as we seem to be? And it's unfortunate to say, it's easy to say that the media is motivated to sell a good story, but it's unfortunate to remind ourselves that academics are also motivated to sell a good story. And that includes all the papers that I've done, as well as everyone else's papers, because if it's published in one of these top journals, it's because someone found it kind of interesting or just a little bit salacious, right? And Twitter or academic journals, salacious still sells and gets things published. So, hey, everybody, we're all really polarized. This is a huge problem. We need to solve it. That's a good story to sell. But hey, everybody, we kind of get along and conversation works as you'd expect it. And, more or less dialogue is productive. That's not a very interesting story. Of course, these days you could sell that story by pitting it against the very popular story of polarization. But, it makes it very, very difficult to tell, if we're even polarized, and if so, where? Where do most of our images of polarization come from? I'm not so much going to throw academics under the bus, but the media, right? The media is publishing. There's written stories. I don't watch TV news, but I assume there's TV news stories about a nation divided with big, important graphics and probably sounds of war, whenever, whichever side you're not on is described. So that it's, to me, a question even then of how much are we really divided and how much do we just think we're divided? And that, of course, is going to be most associated with that hating the other side, which also I hope is much easier to change than, factual beliefs about the state of the world, because I'm going to dwell a little bit into territory that's beyond my expertise, but a lot of it's going to be about what's salient, or what is the media priming me to? So if the media primes me to constantly think about the differences, then that's going to stoke some affective polarization. But if the media were to prime me to, oh, isn't it so great that we have these different opinions and we can have such productive dialogue? And I'm so glad that the other side is out there to give us some diversity of perspective. Obviously, that's going to change our affective beliefs very deeply, although I'm speculating here, of course, but without probably changing our beliefs about the state of the world. But who knows, really? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not just solving everything right here.
So it's solved, fixed, healed. I do think that's an interesting point that, if you are thinking about things in less of a zero sum, I hate the other side type of way, right? That even people who you disagree with, you can sort of think about them as simply choosing to make a different trade-off, right? That almost every policy prescription is going to have some sort of trade-off, and that where exactly you think that you should sit in terms of those trade-offs is potentially up for debate amongst reasonable people, right? And that's a totally different way of approaching it than this side is out to get me and I'm out to get them. Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
So can I change the topic?
Oh yeah, totally.
And I'll tell you what this is kind of making me think about, because I'm with at the risk of sounding just a little bit paranoid or conspiracy theorist, I think a lot of this stuff, frankly, is a bit of a smokescreen or a distraction. Now, to dial back the paranoia a bit, I'm not saying anybody is clever enough to do this on purpose, but the end result is that we spend a lot of time arguing with each other and hating the other side, which is to say our neighbors and our family members at Thanksgiving, rather than addressing any kind of fundamental social issues at a deeper level, or taking our actual government or corporate overlords to task for anything serious. It makes me think about a little bit this sort of bowling alone problem, which is to say, when you really dive into this, the polarization thing is a question of social structure more broadly. I don't think any of this political polarization story is happening in a vacuum. And one of the other trends, and can
I interrupt you quickly and just request that you explain bowling alone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So one of the trends, to explain bowling alone, one of the major trends of the last few decades has been television. And that's something that's impacted both social structure and politics. So here's a little bit of a less paranoid connection here. So one of the biggest, depending on who you ask, and I'm sort of outside my wheelhouse here, so take this with a grain of salt, but one of the most key characteristics of the change in the political landscape over the past few decades has been the rise of cable news. And that's important because prior to cable news, broadcast news was subject to government regulation because the government is giving them the airspace to broadcast, is literally broadcast on radio waves. So they're subject to all sorts of rules about neutrality or equal airtime, all the things we associate with good news and the things that we don't associate with cable news. And pick your least favorite cable news channel to think about when I say this, because cable news is not subject to any kind of legal obligation of neutrality or fair and balanced. They just put it up on their screen like a logo. So the rise of cable news let people pretty much do whatever they want in the news space. Another aspect of the growth of television and culture is the way it shapes our social network. So Bowling Alone is a book by Robert Putnam, who makes the argument that people aren't going to bowl together. There, he is writing essentially about the demise of the bowling league or the weekly bowling crew. I don't even really know because it's all fallen apart, right? Yeah. But as people used to have to basically get together with people to do stuff that was interesting and entertaining, now we can just sit on our couch and watch TV all day. So his argument is that there's been a fundamental breakdown in society. And the reason that's important is because very, very broadly within sociology or social theory is this notion of social capital. So if I have a network where I interact with people in shared spaces, the people I know all know each other. But if we live in isolated, individualistic, fragmented lives, then mostly the people I know don't know each other. I know some people from work, some people maybe from school, somebody I see at the bar from time to time, but they don't talk to each other. And the ability for your friends or your peers to talk to each other is very important in shaping things like the spread of social norms, because people can't enforce social norms as easily if they can't talk to each other. I can't say, hey, did you hear what Todd was doing last week? That's really kind of trashy of him. And then that person goes, yeah. And then we go to Todd together. And that kind of spreading process can't happen in a more fragmented society. So there's just a lot of theories.
I do need to be socially shamed to rein in my behavior.
Right. So, not that that's the only route to reinforcement, but that kind of those triangles, which is to say the third person that knows both me and Todd, they're a triangle shape when you plot out on paper social networks. Those are just theorized to play all sorts of important roles in building social capital and contributing to, healthy, robust societies. And they play a particularly important role in collective action. So collective action is what you get essentially when a lot of people need to coordinate, which is to say all simultaneously agree to participate in some kind of action to generate a public good. But the issue is that so it could be something like chipping in money to build a community center. We need $1 million to build a community center, and as long as enough people chip in, then we'll get that community center, but everybody can benefit from it. So it's a collective action problem because I can be a social loafer, right? So I can let everybody else chip in and then I get the benefit of the community center. And it turns out having these overlapping social ties, this nice healthy social network that we get by going to bowling clubs together is really valuable in overcoming the collective action problem. And that's exactly what we're talking about when we talk about things like taking government to task or enacting any kind of real social change in the world. So to bring it back to my crazy person paranoid starting point, all of this stuff about how much we hate each other not only reinforces divides, but it distracts us from, focusing on any of these other aspects of our social existence or our social world. And it all just kind of adds up to an even deeper collective action problem.
So it sounds like you are potentially more interested in this, whatever, bigger picture dynamic of how social networks are structured and what their role is in shaping a society, for lack of a better word, and that people just kept coming to you with, well, yeah, but what about politics? And you're like, okay, like we'll figure out politics for you.
Yeah. So if it's a little bit, I mean, if it's okay for me to go really off topic,
let's do it.
Then I'll back up a few steps and say that even the politics stuff comes up because my day job, as it were, which is to say being a researcher, by just a little bit of coincidental history. I mean, you follow these threads in academic research, especially when you're a grad student, and you just need to get your dissertation done. So I fell into this research of collective intelligence. It's something that's very interesting to me. I really like theorizing about and studying organizations because there are great sites, hopefully someday, for actual experiments in terms of changing social networks and see how they work. But I got into that because I'm really just very broadly interested in collectives. And that's because I'm interested very broadly in this question. You could call it kind of a collective action problem, but I'm just interested in this question of how can we make the world a better place? I mean, the future is coming. To be super cryptic, the future is coming. It will be something. We all have different preferences about what the future will be. And we can either try to shape the world to match our preferences, or we can just kind of stumble blindly forward, letting history unfold as it will. And I think for most of history, we've been doing the stumbling forward thing. And to some extent, that's because everybody's got different preferences, right? We're all fighting over, how things are going to look. And that's, of course, what politics are pretty much all about. But I think for the most part, there's no sense in which any kind of collective, which is to say society, is in any way being intentional. Even if we all disagree, there's no sense in which society is being intentional about the future. So I'm very interested in whether or not, it's even possible for a collective to come together and through some inevitable process of disagreement, produce something that looks at the collective level like anything other than stumbling blindly forward through history. I mean, history and the social world, which is to say humanity, is essentially a complex system. And by complex system, I mean it's a giant hairball of many, many different smaller parts that each operate according to their own individual principles. You can think about like neurons in your brain or cells in your body. Every neuron in your brain, basically it's like, hey, there's a bunch of other neurons around me. I'm going to sit here and do my neuron thing. And the neurons around me are going to fire. I'm going to react to those. There's external stimuli, and I have some internal set of rules that governs how I react. And every now and then I'm going to fire on the other neurons next to me. So every neuron is following its own internal set of rules, reacting to the outside world, as it were. But when you look at the brain as a whole, it has coherence, right? It's a complex system that is an emergent phenomena of all these individual, what I'll call loosely, cellular automata. And the world is like that too. I mean, essentially you've got all these people and we're all just doing our own thing in our daily lives 99% of the time. But when you step back and look, the world is a sort of coherent, complex system. Economics and trade and the stock market and corporations and innovation and technology, building an iPhone takes the coordination of millions of different players, or I don't know, some very large number of different players, each doing their little cellular automaton thing, but it produces a coherent picture, which is to say a supply chain and a market economy. But just because it has coherence in the system sense doesn't mean there's any sort of intentionality. I mean, the coherent systems can also still stumble blindly forward. So another great example of a fairly coherent complex system is the ecosystem, right? It's a whole lot of different niche players who occupy their little role and eat these things and are prey to those other things and leave these byproducts, but it ends up forming an equilibrium, or I guess I'll say non-equilibrium system, because it's relatively stable but changes gradually over time. But evolution of the ecosystem as a whole is stumbling blindly forward. It's the product of just a lot of different random interactions, right? And that's a lot of what society is. It's not really any different from which is to say the ecosystem of which we are a part is not really different from how it ever was in this blindly stumbling forward sense. So I like to think about how it could possibly be different. Sorry for that super long.
No, it's great.
Rambling take.
It's great. Love it. So I mean, it sounds like that. Your primary interest is thinking about how this social system organizes itself, and is there a way to understand it better to potentially do something other than blindly stumble forth, or to blindly stumble forth in a more preferable way?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll leave blindly stumble forth in a more preferable way to someone else. So there is a very interesting question you put forth, which was, how does the complex system organize itself? So there's a whole study or a whole body of research on self-organization. I know very little about that body of research. It's people asking, a lot of it is zoologists, I guess, or people who study animals. They're studying things like ants. Ants display a lot of complex emergent behavior. They're asking how that works.
Yeah,
like that.
And actually, if anyone is sort of interested, you went on your rant about the ecosystem or whatever, if you just Google or look on YouTube for weird ant stuff, you'll find a ton of very visual examples of a complex system kind of self-organizing into something insane.
And in fact, there's a lot of crossovers. So there's this guy, Albert Kao. He's at the Santa Fe Institute for Complex Systems, and he comes out of an animal lab, and he mostly studies ants and amoebas, slime molds, really. But he also does work
slime
on
mold
wisdom
videos
crafts.
also.
So he has a whole paper where he dives really deeply into this question of how people count the number of jelly beans in a jar. So there's a lot of crossover, and my Twitter feed, of course, is regularly graced by very cool videos of ants and termites and schools of fish and flocks of birds and all that. But that's not what I do. I don't know nearly as much as I'd like to about self-organization. What I'm really interested in is that sort of engineering perspective, because at the end of the day, I mean, if you're asking these questions about social change and you want to do anything about it, you have to be an activist. And if you're an activist, then you should be sitting down and asking yourself, what do I want to do? And what's the best way to do it? And that, of course, leads to the next chain of, questions. How do I do that? And what's the best way to do that? And that's an engineering problem, right? It's also a theoretical problem. Knowing what do I want to do is not an easy question to answer, but it's an engineering problem. So I ask, how could things be different? How could we grab the steering wheel of history, as it were? So that's why my research is often, I look at these social network conditions and it's like, no, you can get that in a lab, but you can never get that in the real world. And that's part of why I study organizations, because I'm asking, how could it be? What does the possibility space look like? And so my research is very narrowly focused around objective outcomes, because to some extent, I'm a product of my structural environment, and I work in a management school.
Yeah, you got to play the game.
To keep my job, I got to publish in management journals, which means I got to study questions that are of interest to managers, and that's usually how can we be more efficient or optimal on some objective dimension. But what my best estimate right now for the question of how could we do it, is a lot more related to collective identity, which is it's sort of exactly what it sounds like. Who are we? Who do we think we are? You have your individual identity, which is who you are, and then the collective identity is what do you think about the collective? How do you relate to the collective? Do you identify with it? And collectives can mean a lot of different things. You, as an individual, have the luxury of existing in a lot of different collective type organisms. And this, I talk about grabbing the steering wheel or, moving forward in history with intention rather than stumbling blindly. And any kind of intention requires something to have intention, an ego, a self, right? A consciousness. So inevitably it raises questions of whether such a thing as a collective consciousness is a meaningful concept. And I'll, cut a long rambling short, which is to say, I've come to the conclusion that a collective consciousness is a meaningful concept, and it's in fact a necessary prerequisite for any kind of intention. And then the question for me as an activist is, okay, how do we raise collective consciousness? And even just phrasing it that way calls to mind so I realize I sound a little bit like a crazy person sometimes. That's exactly, not even joking, that's why I got a PhD and why I'm going to be a professor, mainly so people take me seriously when I talk about collective consciousness.
That guy sounded like he was off his meds, but it said PhD, so I don't know.
And so this notion of raising consciousness is a very traditional activist technique. So, and I'm going to acknowledge I don't know a lot about this subject here, so apologies if I get some words or language wrong. But within the feminist movement of the 70s, 60s-ish, whenever that was, the notion of organizing consciousness raisings was a key tool in their repertoire as activists. So they were trying to develop an identity as women, which is to say, spawn into existence the notion of a community that is to say we. You need to be able to say there is a we. And I suppose prior to that, they were more like what Marx would have called a Lumpenproletariat or a sack of potatoes, which is to say more of a collection than a collective, because there always were many women, but there wasn't a kind of we or us. Although here I want to just acknowledge that I'm speaking very much outside my expertise. But
there you go, and you're coding for left-leaning politics with your apologizing. So then all the right-leaning listeners are going to be polarized now.
No, it's not so much about that. And I don't have any opinions one way or another that I'll say right now about feminism. The point is that they saw consciousness raising as a useful tool. If you want to change the condition of a group of people, and they wanted to change the condition of women, then you need to identify and create that group of people. So if we want to change the condition of all of people, then we need to generate and create that people. As humanity, I believe there's this potential to be more than a sack of potatoes, which is to say, to have some kind of, or more likely, very many different identities as humans. It's a very difficult, I think, narrative to make compelling because it has to be transcendent of any other kind of social or political boundaries in the most ideal form. And it's really hard to convince most people that just this notion or identity of us as all humans is more important than whatever their particular topic of concern is. And I think that's totally legitimate. Ultimately, social change, like any other kind of human endeavor, is going to be a division of labor.
Sure. And when you're talking about collective consciousness, I think there's probably a few different ways that someone could interpret that, right? Someone could interpret that as, maybe focused on the different layers of network dynamics that you were talking about previously, creating some sort of like emergent social network that could be labeled a collective consciousness. It could be something kind of spooky where it's like, oh yeah, we're all sort of like spiritually entwined and are, using our collective consciousness to put something forth into the world. It could even mean, when you were saying raising consciousness, just like building awareness of something that people as a group are potentially not aware of, and then facilitating certain connections between that group. What do you actually mean by that term?
Yeah, so I'm going to say the first and the third, which is to say something about network dynamics and something about people being aware of, and not, I love that you use the term spooky because it reminds us of one of those classic physicists from the EPR papers, I forget which one, talking about spooky action at a distance, and that's their magnetism or gravity or whatever. So I'm not talking about spooky.
I think they're talking about quantum entanglement.
Maybe, quantum entanglement, whatever the debates were between Einstein and the other ones. So I'm not talking about spooky action at a distance. I don't think there's a collective consciousness in the sense that I can sit down and connect in any way with even my twin brother who's in New York right now, except step by, of course, sending him a text message. So that's
Do you guys speak in a twin language that only you understand?
I speak in a twin language that everyone understands, and it's English. But the text message is where that action at a distance becomes very real, and that's where you start to get into things like network dynamics. So the network dynamics questions are like, how do the just various sets of humans doing human things as our little individual cellular automata, how do we all bounce off each other to produce collective consciousness? But I think the first step is the third thing you mentioned, which is just trying to get people to be aware of things they maybe weren't aware of before, which is to say the first step is to realize you are, in fact, part of a collective. Whether you're aware of it or not, whether you have this collective identity or not, you're part of all sorts of communities and collectives. And just to think about that, nothing that you have, nothing that you get in life is something that you get individually. When an artist, that like lone, hero artist alone in their studio, and they create a painting, they're actually participating in, the entire history of artistic conversation. They're inspired and aware of and responding to ideas created by other artists. They're shaped by technological advancements. They're using pigments that other people made. And, if you ask an artist, they'll tell you that the type of pigments you can get are, very important to determining, what you can paint. So every endeavor that we do as humans is standing on the shoulders of giants is a common way to say it. But also like the bread that I get from the store, it's one of the oft marveled results of an efficient market economy is that the bread, or the store rather, just magically has the exact amount of bread that people need to eat that week in that particular neighborhood.
And a wide variety of flavors and options as well.
All of your material existence, all of your emotional and cultural existence is brought to you by other people. So there's that level of realization. And then there's the realization of just how these network dynamics operate. So we have a body of research, or we have some papers that contribute to a larger body of research on what's called the emergence and change of social conventions. So social conventions are things like, why do we shake with the right hand and not the left? Why do we drive on, the left side of the road and not the right side of the road? I'll put it that way because I'm, moving to London.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
I don't know which hand they shake with there, actually. And so those are just all the little, micro things that shape our social world that we have to coordinate on, right? I don't really care which side of the road I drive on, as long as I drive on the same side of the road as you, right? Because obviously if we don't successfully coordinate, there's disastrous consequences. So one of the things we look at is how those things are created and how those things change over time. And it's sort of like a physics that, in fact, one of our collaborators is a physicist. He's Andrea Baronchelli, who's based out of City University in London. And he's one of the key people who really developed the mathematical models that let you study these kinds of dynamics, because there's a lot of really useful physics tools that help us to study social systems. Because when you zoom out enough, you're all unique and beautiful snowflakes. Yes, you have free will, you have agency, but conveniently we can model that free will as a sort of noisy randomness. And when you zoom out a lot, a million little noisy random particles start to make sense. That's again coming back to the coherent complex systems. So to speak loosely, one way of thinking about it is that everybody's kind of bouncing off each other. We're all making, before the convention emerges, we're all making little decisions. I'm going to try to shake with my right hand. I'm going to try to shake with my left hand. I'm going to try to high five or fist bump or elbow tap. We're all just kind of doing our own little thing, frantically trying to match. We're bouncing off each other. And then what's called symmetry breaking happens. And one of them, just through random chance, happens to become more popular for a second. And then it picks up momentum and spreads from there. So the lesson that I take from this, because that's also how social change happens, once something is an entrenched convention, in order to change it, you have to start doing it. You have to get those reverberations out there, and you have to get them basically to reach what we call a critical mass point, something we can even identify mathematically using some of these physics tools. You have to put those reverberations out there. So to me, this is the very non-leftist physics demonstration of how if you want to get anything done, you need to be the change that you want to see in the world. And I can't even remember now why I started going off on that particular end. But so I guess, yeah, that's the network dynamics that goes along with the awareness. So part of being aware of being in a community is that realizing very literally you're shaping the world that you're in. People are so selfish in this world. And I mean that in a sort of psychological, technical sense in terms of you can rate people on individualism as we were talking about a couple weeks ago. But it's very important to realize that you're actually not alone. The things you do impact other people and that bounces back on you. So I guess another way of phrasing this physics model would be to say what goes around comes around. So part of it is like the realization that you're embedded in a collective in the sense that you owe a lot of or everything about your life to the collective. Your life wouldn't exist without the collective. And then the other piece is realizing these network dynamics. So realizing like not only do you owe something to collective, but am I allowed to
Oh yeah, go for it.
On this?
Yeah, drop it.
Basically, be careful about you don't shit where you sleep. Like every little thing you do, every decision you make also shapes the world that you live in. So you need to be aware and be careful about that. Basically, the shittier you are to other people, the shittier they're going to be to you, and the shittier the world is. So if you're just basically nice to people, that starts reverberating around. And I'm really conscious when I say these things that it sounds so hippy dippy, and we just have to remind ourselves that this is what the math says. This is coming from that like cold-hearted objective physicist.
Sure. So that the actual local network dynamics of the communities that you're involved with are potentially much more important than most people realize.
Absolutely. And that the local network dynamics are inseparable from the global network dynamics. So one of the key lessons from this large body of research on conventions is that it's through local interaction that global conventions emerge. So to get a little bit management-y for a second, one of the classic examples of conventions is digital communication protocols. Every time you load a website, there's very specific protocols, and which is to say technological conventions that govern how the whole system worked. And these are now established by centralized bodies, but before these standard-setting bodies existed, people just had to figure out what their peers do. So either, in firms in the same industry or the same geographical region as you, this is back in, I don't know, the 80s, maybe, whenever you needed to send them some digital information, you had to choose what protocol am I going to use? What am I going to buy for my IT department? Well, I don't really care what's out there at large. There might even be something that's cheaper or faster or more secure if it doesn't match what my peers are doing. So I'm really ultimately just coordinating locally. But what that produces is these widespread conventions. We now have one standard internet protocol across every firm and every industry and probably, I'm not sure, but every country. So it's that these local interactions very literally, and remember there's math behind it, are shaping the entire global world that we live in. So basically, no matter where you shit, you're shitting where you sleep. So I guess I'm just saying be careful about what you shit or something like that.
In conclusion,
yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that just the idea of I think a lot of folks feel sort of like powerless and lost in the world, and that they undervalue the contributions that they have to their local community and their local networks, because they want to make a difference or whatever, and without realizing that their local network and their local community is in fact how you make a difference. Like you said, from like you get as numbersy as you want with it, and like that's what comes out.
Yeah, so I'm just going to push you a little bit further out into kind of the crazy town area of all this.
Great.
Which is to say that
crazy town is my favorite.
It sounds a little kooky until you remember that I have, there's science behind it all. So, a lot of this is motivated by. So I'm Jewish. I was raised. We have this concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world, or I like to say building the world, making the world a better place. And that's just something that was instilled in me for a long time. So volunteerism or whatever. So that's sort of what motivates me to all this, just making the world a better place. But there's a flip side of it, which is that ever since, if you're a Nietzsche fan, ever since God died, the world has been kind of a cold and lonely place. And there's a lot of questions that we got from God. Things like, why am I here? And what should I do with my life? And what happens when I die, right? So the collective has the potential, if you want it to answer a lot of those questions. So like, what should I do? Well, do things that are good for the collective. And that's not an easy question to answer, what those goals are or how you can do that. I mean, the physics is still largely unwritten, but at least gives you a perspective to orient yourself towards. And also like, what happens when I die? I mean, the nice thing about these reverberations is that everything you do, every little thing you do, really does shape everything else that's going on around presently and into the future. There's a feature of what we call path dependence in a lot of complex systems. A lot of people might think of things like the butterfly effect or sensitivity to initial conditions, but every little change now inexorably alters the changes in the future.
So we've touched on a few things throughout this conversation that I think all kind of combine to form, let's just say, like a general phenomenon that I'm concerned with, right? So we discussed Bowling Alone and Robert Putnam's work. So the sort of like fracturing of our local ties, right? And I found his argument pretty compelling about it essentially being a combination of the increased opportunity cost of going out because we can, watch TV and all that kind of stuff and play on our phones now, as well as the increased transaction cost of actually being a part of a bunch of different networks because people commute now. They aren't as tied into their local community. Like you mentioned, they have a bunch of different spots that they potentially are part of a community, but those are not tied together, right? So we have this sort of fracturing of certain social networks that used to be prominent. We have a loss of trust in institutions, right? Which we sort of talked about with polarization, that people are not as trusting in the government, in the church, in whatever. We have we mentioned some academia and some perverse incentives there, right? We have a variety of inadequate equilibria, to use Eliezer's term, where we sort of have people optimizing for something that isn't necessarily what the institution should be optimizing for. So people chasing prestige or whatever in a way that isn't actually beneficial to, let's say, advancing science and academia, or chasing promotion within their firm that isn't beneficial to the actual creation of value for the marketplace, right? And then all those things together with a general slowing down of progress in scientific research and economic growth and all that sort of create like an uncomfortable perspective. So what should we do about it? How should we save our social networks?
So I definitely don't buy the slowdown in scientific progress, but I don't think that's really at the core of what you're talking about. Yeah. This broader thing, which is to say the bowling alone problem, I think that's something we should really seriously think about. And I want to acknowledge that Putnam as well was operating within this good stories sell kind of paradigm. So, if you look at some of his statistics, he's like taking the highest voter turnout in one year and comparing it to the lowest voter turnout in another year. But I think the general message, which is to say that we're very individualized and fragmented, is absolutely true. But I think it extends much further back than Putnam is really acknowledging, which is to say it's a feature of Western society. I mean, ever since we stopped living in extended family type of community settings or tribes, where we have maybe a few hundred people that are all vaguely related to us and we all know, and they all know each other, right? So we have those triangles, those overlapping social ties. Ever since we moved away from that to the more nuclear family, and then especially with, the rise of factory and industrial labor further, separating people in their work, we're all just each following the rules, the things set by our supervisor. We entered into this very individualistic society. So that's, I guess I agree with you, which is to say, I think that's something I think a lot about. It's absolutely something that I am concerned about, because setting aside all the crazy town stuff I mentioned about like the collective intelligence is replacing that like Sunday morning God type of thing, there's very straightforward, I think, psychological and medical lab type evidence, which is to say on both humans and rats, that people are simply happier when they're with other people. super introverts aside, by and large, people like having friends, and honestly, they like having frenemies. And even if we hate our family, most people are still happier if they do have a family. So all of the science and technical stuff aside, I would say if there's one thing I want to convince people, it's that other people matter, and that community matters, and that we should operate as if we live in collectives, and operate as if other people matter, and operate as if community matters, and spend some time with them. I mean, jokes aside, one of the effects of the decline in religiosity that's basically widespread throughout the world is that people don't all get together on Sunday mornings anymore. And I don't really remember, maybe that's something that Putnam talks about too. But, aside from the spiritualism and metaphysics, one very real effect of church was that you had those overlapping social ties. You had a whole lot of people that you knew that could, help you move or watch your kids for you, or, maybe you moved to a new town. If I were a practicing Jew, I could just show up at the nearest synagogue and have instant community, someone to recommend a dentist to me after I moved to London, if they have dentists in London. I'm not really sure about that. So that's the loss of this very, frankly, useful social structure and tool is something that happened not, along with the loss of Sunday morning gatherings and many other things, the ease with which we can keep ourselves occupied by watching TV instead of, going to hang out is something worth thinking about. But so I think the most important message is that community matters, and we don't have these default gatherings anymore. So we have to work a little bit. The blessing and curse of the 21st century is that people are more accessible than ever before due to transportation, due to communication, and yet there's less of a default impetus to actually connect with other people. And humans are, if nothing else, the default creature, right? We're shaped by default options. That's one of the key nudge principles, right? So try to find some way to make other people a default part of your life, and then I like to think a lot of the other stuff will start happening. So as you build these triangle ties, these clustering social ties, the mathematical structure of social capital, the other stuff sort of starts to grow in it. It's like, building a terrarium, and the seeds or spores or whatever kind of come out from the environment. But, that's, we also have to work at it. It's a little bit like, I can tell you as a married person, it's a little bit like relationships. People often fail at relationships when they think they're supposed to be default or easy. We actually have to work at how we interact with other people. So, I don't know.
So would you say that we should think globally and act locally?
But I think we should also think locally as well. And it's interesting. I've actually been thinking about starting a blog, and I wanted to call it Think Locally, Act Globally, because one of the most valuable ways you can make social change is by changing perceived norms. And so it's hard not to get political, but I honestly don't think climate change or the climate crisis rather is a political issue. One of the most important characteristics of public opinion on climate change is that everybody, Democrats and Republicans, underestimates how many other people think the climate crisis is an issue, which is to say, in actuality, I forget the exact numbers, something like 70% of people think it's an issue. That's how many people care. That's most people. But on average, people think that 55% of people think it's an issue. So they think it's a much weaker majority. And that comes back to those reverberations in the physics of conventions. Your perception of the size of the majority is a very important thing. So you can act globally because we have these digital technologies to talk about things and try to shape perceptions about public opinion. But you should also very much act locally. I think a really, really easy way to do that is to get a Sunday brunch together. So I actually have a group of people from my neighborhood who get together every single weekend except for when I'm out of town and have brunch. And, it's a relatively small group because my apartment is pretty small, but, we have maybe 10 people who get together on the regular, and it's easy. It's cognitively easy. We do the same thing at the same day, same time, always eat waffles, no problem. And that sort of ritual, that repeated weekly thing enables that kind of social interaction because it makes it so easy. You don't have to think about it. There's no anxiety. Everybody. It's the same thing, week in and week out, and you just get to go and enjoy waffles and other people and be with other people.
Love it. So, Joshua, if people want to follow you on Twitter or read your scientific papers or any of that kind of stuff, what should they do?
So, so you can Google me. My name is Joshua Becker. I'm a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. That should be enough for you to broadly find me on the internet. I do have a website. It's joshua-becker.com. I'm on Twitter at Joshua_A_Becker. My name is Joshua Aaron Becker, and there are just way too many Joshua Beckers out there. There's even another Joshua Aaron Becker at Northwestern University that I found in the system. But that should be enough information for you to triangulate my position and figure out which of these papers and things out there are mine and which website is mine. If it's on medical research, that's not me. If it's on collective intelligence, that is me. Although I do have one paper in a medical journal because we were studying how social influence shapes exercise behavior.
Do you feel a sense of community with the other Joshua Beckers or a sense of polarization?
I feel a sense of polarization because the Twitter handle at Joshua Becker is occupied by someone who hasn't tweeted since they opened the account. And then the other Joshua Becker has a very, very popular blog. So this isn't, I suppose, polarized. There's another Joshua Becker out there with a super popular blog, I think like Netflix special or something called Becoming Minimalist, which is totally something I could see myself doing in another life. I'm a big fan of minimalism, both in data visualization and how I decorate my apartment. But so I guess it's sort of a mixed bag.
Got it. So that's potentially a future research topic for you.
Yeah. But I'd say as a whole, we're definitely Lumpenproletariat because we all exist. We maybe know about each other, but we're not connected in any way. We're not really capable of any kind of collective action.
Yeah, no collective consciousness there. Love it.
Thanks for listening. If you like the show, the best thing to do would be to send it to one of your friends who also likes podcasts. If you want more, I have an email list where I send out a weekly update with all the podcasts I've recorded and articles that I've written. I also include my favorite things that I've been reading or listening to as well. You can sign up for that at www.toddneve.com. That's I before E, or you can open up the show notes in your podcast player and click the link in there.